Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm Jung Wan, the moderator of this session. This is a AAEA track section of specialty crop supply chain. The first presenter will be Dr. David Zilpin from Berkeley. He will be presenting value chain in agriculture, cereal, and the case of vegetable. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, the usual standard. So my base, I'll start with the big picture. I really got interested in supply chain, and I really think that working with some big food companies, that I asked them, why do you need economists to estimate supply or demand? And I said, gosh, that's easy. Master student can do it. The big problem is how to design supply chain. This is the biggest economic problem. And I've been fascinated by it for about 10 or 15 years. We work on biofuel. I tried to design a supply chain for hydrogen. I worked with Mars to design supply chain for chocolate. So to me, developing a supply chain understanding of the role of supply chain is really crucial. Now, there is a law, it's very important that people in development economics start really recognizing the importance of supply chains in the transformation of Eastern Europe. Some of the work is analytical, Sweden, some Reardon, a lot of it is descriptive. And I really think it was very important because it, for example, it realized the important role of supermarkets in developing countries as well as the United States. But I really think that we have to go much beyond that. And the key is that, in my view, we have to modify the way that we think about economics. And I think this is a big challenge for AgriCon because we can lead the way. What is the basic point? The basic point is that we live in a world that is not like the world of Adam Smith. Adam Smith lived in a world where competition was reasonable. And there was limited number of goods. Today, goods are endogenous. They change all the time. Many of the goods that I had as a kids don't exist. And now I need to get adjusted to new products from a lot of different type of foods to YouTube and Google. So to some extent, the goods are endogenous. There is much less reliance on markets. Markets become an exception rather than the rule. And we need to have some sort of a new theory. So what I try, and it's relevant to agriculture, we have high rate of innovation, not only in developed countries, in developing countries. Anyone wants to increase value added because that's the way to increase profit. And more we move to contracting rather than market. Now, a lot of people are against the move for contracting and they worry about the smallholder. Now, obviously, I worry about the smallholder, but to develop an understanding of the world, you have to understand and when I say smallholder, I don't only mean smallholder in developing countries, I mean about small farms in America. But you really need to understand all the supply chain in order to be effective when you deal with a small farmer in America. So I try to develop a little bit of a theory here, and it's some of it in a paper that we have recently in PNAS. And so the basic idea that we have two sets of linked supply chain. One is the innovation supply chain. The other is the product supply chain. And if you look at the system, you really have innovation. And then innovation can move to the system in two ways. It can move through the educational industrial complex, through universities and startup, etc., or it can come through product design companies that someone think, okay, I will have a good idea, for example, Federal Express, and I will hire some people to design it, and then you have a new type of product. So when you have a someone design a supply chain, the first thing that they try to estimate demand, they try to estimate adoption. There is no supply without demand. No one will start investing in anything if they don't think they will make money. So the role of estimating demand is to predict demand ex ante, not so you use ex post studies in order to estimate ex ante. Now, a lot of time people use demographer, marketer, and they try to look at issues demographic. So I started a model that's called the imitation model. That was not I started, basically started by many others that look at imitation, not as a diffusion, which is very important, not as a process of not as a process of imitation, but as a process that really have individual that learn about what they do, basically assess, and then they make a decision, but they are heterogeneous. Because of heterogeneity, you really not everyone adopt at the same time. So we have also, if you look at what marketers do, they look a lot of time at demographic and they look at market segment. And unfortunately, they use sociologists for it. There aren't many economies that do it, but even though it's economic phenomenon, and the key point is you have heterogeneity, always we need to write to the right person. So you understand, you have demand, and then you have to decide the supply chain. So here, this is the simple supply chain. You have to decide what will be the scale, how much I produce myself, how much other produce for me, and then how much I sell to retailer, to Walmart, how much I sell to restaurant. And so again, I spoke a little bit about the innovation supply chain. I don't have a lot of time. Now let's speak about the product supply chain. When you have a product supply chain, you may have a new crop or variety or equipment or anything that you need for producing a new crop. And then you assess future demand, you maximize expected net present value, and then you determine how much you produce and how much you produce in-house, how much you produce in contract or in market. In fruit and vegetables, there are less and less production by market. You try a lot of time to give specification and expect others to do it. I think that in the future, you wouldn't buy a lot of things by market because everything will be fit to your specific need. Like when you, a lot of time, when you try to remodel your house, you may buy some generic part, but really the key element is the credit constraint. You can be supported, if you have a new company, you may be supported by a venture capital, hedge fund, government fund, and different type of credit will affect what type of product you will have. So the basic calculation on SCF time is expected net present value and minus variable cost and capital cost. And it depends. If you have relative advantage in producing a lot of fruit or vegetables, you have a big plantation where you process a product and then you produce a product and process it. In many cases, someone else produces a product and you process it. You have also a combination, and there are many examples. For example, in the wine industry, almost every winery grows a little bit of wine, grapes, but they buy most of the grapes. And many times they build a big capacity of the big middle-sized capacity, and they grow based on their success. So winery is a combination of you have the processing facility and you buy from farmers. The best example for me of an interesting supply chain, and it's huge, is flowers from Kenya. Kenya is the second largest flower producer in the world. And it's a specialty crop. So someone realized, okay, Europe really needs flour. The ideal place to grow it is Kenya. So what they did, they first built some area in the airport for shipping. They built the farm. It was a vertical integration operation. As demand increased, they taught other people how to grow it. Now it's several $billion industry. Another example is pre-cut lettuce in California. Someone realized that you can make more money if you pre-cut lettuce. So what happened is in the beginning they have a farm and a processing facility. They sold the processing facility. The name of the company is Fresh Express. They're about, I don't know, they're big. They now belong, I think, they belong to Chiquita Banana. There are several $billion. but the story of this company is that they basically process, they produce very little themselves, they buy from farmers, and then they sell part of it to instituting, to restaurant, but most of it to retailers. In the beginning, they were producing only lettuce. Now they have salad that include a lot of fruits. So that's the way the future of agriculture. As an agricultural economist, you have to recognize that things are changing. Then a lot of time processing are playing, are really determining what will happen to implement innovation. Now, there are a lot of conflict because we work for growers and they are the voters, and there is a pressure between the processor and the farmers, and you have some big processors that may also, they use market power because that's part of the game. But I think that this is a reality and we can change it, but we need to be realistic about what's going on. Now, I always like to bring this picture because a lot of time, if you're really a good entrepreneur, you're a monopoly and you make a lot of money. And you make a lot of money based on your market power, but market power doesn't last. So a lot of time you have a big processor that starts with develop a product, make a lot of money, but over time, other people enter to the field, so the big processor is moving to other areas. But basically making excess profit is not something that is necessarily bad. It basically reflects the fact that we have an innovator that, at least in the beginning, develop a monopoly power. And if you're able, through university and other things, to introduce new innovation, then you reduce market power. So the market power is not bad per se. It's bad if it lasts forever, and it lasts forever is because you don't have new innovation that will attack it. And it also may last forever because of barrier for entry. But we really need to understand that countries without a lot of market power are in real trouble. Countries with a lot of market power are also in real trouble because of income distribution. So understanding the role of innovation in market power and the role of R&D and the university and other sources of changing the system is really crucial. Now, one thing is that all the time supply chain expand. Walmart started in a little place in the south and moved all over. McDonald's, Fresh Express, they are all expand. But we really need to understand, how does it happen? How you move from one country to another? Companies move, engage in foreign direct investment, and they grow in two ways. On one way, they try to move forward and they offer other party to partner with them. And other ways, you have people in developing countries that say, gosh, I have some money, I want to have some business, so why don't I have a partner in the United States that provides for me technology? So if you look at the US and Mexico, we have incredible symbiotic relationship in Mexico. You have food supply chain that either started in the US and moved to Mexico, or vice versa. Mexicans that have partner in the US. And if you look at fruit and vegetable, for example, I know the mango market, people in Peru that are really dominant have partners that are all over the world, in Morocco and other countries. So understanding how this type of alliances emerge is very important to understand the product of supply chain. Now, credit is really determined what will be the future of the industry. And I think people expect us as economists to know finance. So different type of status of supply chain have different type of finance. Government foundation funding is crucial for research and for the development of technology. Venture capital and the self-finance a lot of time help you to develop a new product. Then upscaling of a supply chain, again, developers depend on the stock market, on bank and venture capital. To me, understanding how finance works is really important. Without being able to finance a business, things are very difficult. So a lot of time, if you look at agribusiness, the most important person at the time is the financier that is able how to get money using land as mortgage and other things. These are things that we really don't think about, but think about buying your house. I don't know how many of you have houses. The number one issue when buying a house is how you finance it. And the complexity of finance is really important. It's also important for businessmen. Now, another thing that is really important is adaptation and pivoting. The thing about the economic is that a lot of time you take an old term and you call it something new, and then you have a paper. So what we called once adaptation, now people call pivoting. So I use the term pivoting because I want to get some credit, but it's old-fashioned adaptation. And the basic adaptation, the basic idea of adaptation is the idea behind Dixit and Pindyck, that you have a company and they think of when would they adopt a new technology? And they say, when the time is right, they'll adopt a new technology. Namely, if there is big demand or price go down or if there is a shock. So to some extent, mechanization, for example, in America occurred in fruit and vegetables after the Bracero program held. The Bracero program hand. How many of you know about the Bracero program? It's really crucial because it really changed the way that US agriculture operates, and it also led to the United Farm Workers. Now they decided to raise minimum wage. You'll see a lot of mechanization. Mexicans don't migrate very much to America. Again, there will be a lot of mechanization. So these are the things that really affect, or this type of shock affect system. Of course, the pandemic, you cannot go you cannot go to supermarket. Someone will introduce, I don't know, Uber food or some other thing. So shocks are very important on innovation. So a lot of time, people are waiting for shock to enter. I was consulting to irrigation companies many, many years ago, and I remember that there was one irrigation company that tried to have constant presence and make a lot of money over time. They went bankrupt. The other companies that basically had very low level of operation most of the time, and every time there was a drought, they operated very fast, drilling well, introducing drip, other conservation, made a lot of money. So resilience, so pivoting is very important. Now, resilience is a nice term, but investing too much in resilience is stupid because you waste capital. So first, you need to have capacity to respond very fast. Oh God, that's great, man! I thought I finished. First, you need to have capacity to adapt very fast. You need to think about contingency plans, but investing too much in insurance is not such a big deal. Especially for big companies that have some money in the inside insurance. But the reality is that we need to educate people to have contingency plan and to have the capacity to adapt very fast. If you look at the pandemic, the US did very well, not the US, all the world. Agriculture did quite well during the pandemic because people adapted all over the world. It wasn't easy. For a while, you didn't have toilet paper, but the impact on food security wasn't as bad as one would have expected because of the capacity of firm to modify very fast. It's not only that in the US you start having companies that bring you food to home. All over the world, suddenly you saw digitization and other things. So thinking in terms of a static economy that is plodding all the time is a lot of time wrong. What really determines your ability to be resilient is your capacity to develop contingency plans and operate them very fast. So I think that is another issue that we have to recognize when we look about all these things. What are the implications of research? First, we need to know the stories. I think today, honestly, most of this generation don't know any story, they know statistics. And statistics are the very interesting stories, but if the effort of your life is to collect data and to be rigorous and find instruments, you may have a lot of instruments, but you know very little economics. So of course it's essential to know good econometrics, but science is much more than econometrics. You need to know the stories. You need to know what are the policies and what are the mechanisms. Now, you need to have conceptual modeling of of innovation supply chain, product supply chain. Start with the stories and then move a little bit for mathematics. Now, empirical work should have three elements. You need to have descriptive studies, and it's really important to have descriptive studies because if you really, if someone's saying, "God, how do I understand the vegetable industry or the fruit industry?" You really need to understand how big company started and what was the strategy and what are the factors behind it. And a lot of time you say, "I need 500 observations to have significant." But what happens if you are in strawberries? You have 3 big companies in the United States. You need to know about these companies. It may have about 400 farmers with 2 acres each, but they're really not very important. So you need to know the story. And then you need to develop model based on these companies. And that's the reason that a lot of time you use theory and simulation. The importance of theory that it helps you to complement what you don't know. So it's very easy to do studies on willingness to pay. I did it myself. It's easy publication, but it's bullshit. It's easy, you take an uninformed undergraduate that go to an individual in the supermarket and ask him, "Would you buy GMO food?" And the guy said, "Yes, no." You write yes, no. You run on a computer, but you don't understand fruits and vegetables. That's not what's behind it. So you really need to understand what drives the system. I have 2 minutes. I stretch the time. Another thing is that you need new data source. You need to have a census of agribusiness. We don't know our agribusiness, how they operate, who are the important player, etc. I have a friend, Tom Reardon. He doesn't know theory, he doesn't know mathematics. He's a good theorist, but he doesn't know mathematics. But he knows every agribusiness firm in the world. And he knows, and the point is this, companies invited him. They invite him to consult. They don't invite most of us. Why? Because he knows what's going on in the companies. Like if you're a marriage counsel, you need to know the couple in addition to know some psychology rather than have sophisticated model, but no context about the model. So that is important. You need also to understand transaction, merger and acquisition. And then you need the keys to understand the economics beyond the farmer gets. Now, for a lot of people say, "God, this is a lot." But this is a huge opportunity. If you do the same farm level economics, no one will pay for it. If you start to understand supply chain, first your life will be interesting. You learn new things. And I really think that it will be an important area. So I really feel that if you look at ag econ today, the fruit and vegetable area is much more interesting because honestly, corn and soybean are boring crops that you have one person that works on 10,000 acres and while he's doing it, he's playing on his little computer game or does, so who cares? Fruit and vegetables, they are important in terms of the big macro policy. So you have 3 people do it in the USDA, great. And, but if you really want to know what's going on, look at fruit and vegetable because eventually all the field crop will become like fruit and vegetable, contracting, specialty crop, etc. So that's my background and that's my talk, and I hope that you like it. Thanks.
I agree. Totally. Science is not about econometrics. I think it's more about story, policy, and mechanism. Thank you, Dr. Zubin.
So, I wonder. So, if you model the innovation for the product supply chain thing, could actually explain why we're now having more prototype goods. So, for example, Tesla. In the past, you would have Apple, they do innovation. Now, eventually, when you know it, you have a phone. But now Tesla, well, I'm still waiting for my separate phone. They're still in the innovation stage, but you still don't. But somehow, the two seems to me are being more and more disconnected. You can develop the innovation supply chain and then the product supply chain instead of being a whole integrated process. I don't know if that's
no. Obviously, the big If you look at the innovation, if you look at the innovation supply chain in food and vegetables, even now, it takes about 20 years to develop a new type of product. With a CRISPR, they hope to go to 5 or 6 or to a short period of time. So if you try to develop it, so a lot of time, the earlier stage, it takes a long time. Now, Tesla is talking about 10 or 15 years to develop it, and Tesla itself, you remember I spoke about 2 types of innovation, university-based innovation, and the fundamental difficult innovation takes many years. Tesla is not a fundamental innovation in terms of the technology. He basically picked and chose technologies and he developed the product. Now, if you look at Tesla, the big innovator was the guy that was running the Nissan and Peugeot, and Nissan and Renault. And he came all the ideas and how to develop an electric car. The only thing that he made a mistake, he didn't think about the battery, and he didn't think about supply chain of the battery. But last, they realized, okay, we have a concept going on. Someone needs to develop the battery and someone needs to develop the supply chain. So he made it of solar energy. So he developed the supply chain of solar energy. So even though it looks big, it's not such a big innovation, it's a different type of letter that it requires new science. So if you look at my innovation supply chain, you have innovation supply chain that are based on existing science and manipulating an innovation supply chain that requires basic science. And Tesla is actually a big product that requires not that much research.
All right, any more questions? Maybe you can save the questions for the end. And the next presenter is Dr. Lu from the University of Logistics.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you, Zhenghui, for inviting me, and glad to talk about logistics for specialty crops and e-commerce. This is a joint work with Xiaoxu Du from University of Idaho, and also Tom Reardon, the one that we just mentioned. One knows all the stories. Yeah, so basically today's talk, we don't have a lot of statistics, mainly stories. So we are, in fact, the plan was, me and Tom, would co-present this, but unfortunately Tom is not here, so I'm going to be the one doing all the storytelling. Really, well, I think two things before we get started. One is, Davis is my advisor, so actually, the work I'm doing here actually is based on what we did before, and after so many years, now I see I'm still nervous. Still remind me of my dissertation days.
And the second thing is, now because Tom is not here, he is really the most amazing storyteller I've ever seen. So I try to do that at this point. Okay, so what's the where do we get started? So when we start to think about supply chains and e-commerce, we actually did this very early, in fact, 8 years, and that's when this is for e-commerce, for food e-commerce. Because at the time, one thing that was to me fascinating was, look, Amazon could do everything, but they cannot do food. They tried Amazon Fresh, starting at 2008, and 10 years they failed. Nothing happened those 10 years. But after they bought food, then everything changed, right? So what's happened, right? And back then, we have this, 2016 paper, talking about supply chains, and the 18 paper on, e-commerce. And, it's very funny, I keep telling my department head, I'm a big beneficiary of COVID, because, at 18, nobody cares. But then there's COVID. And all of a sudden, everybody cares about supply chains and everybody cares about e-commerce. And so, this is I don't know if it's somewhat ironic, but when we look at what are the fundamental issues here. So I'm really glad Zhenghui invited me, because to me, when we see e-commerce, when we see how they are developing their food supply chains, one of the key decisions is how you handle delivery. Because we know in this case, the last mile is probably the most important. And from literature, we know already a lot of things where it's perishable, we have the cold storage, and also you really cannot have the money back guarantees for the food, right? So there are a lot of things going on, but yet you still find those e-commerce are it's unsolvable, they're still doing it. But when you look at how they do it, that's quite different. For example, Amazon, they basically do all of this themselves, right? And on the side of the world, where we have this Alibaba or people where they mainly rely on third party. right? So in our mind, the fundamental, decision that, the e-commerce have to make is who should be doing the logistics, just like David just said, 10 minutes ago. Are you going to do it in the house, or are you going to rely on someone else to provide a service, right? And of course, for economists, we care about why, right? So we want to use a simple model that could capture it. And what we eventually realize is, the model David and I, we built, a long time ago, is actually the perfect model for this, where the main idea is that when we look at e-commerce, there is, whether you do it yourself, or the cost, whether you do it yourself, or you rely on third parties. Well, of course, there's a cost for all the other services, the marketing, the customer service, the payment, everything else, and of course, there's a revenue here. But at the same time, we also notice, hey, each part of this involves tremendous amount of risk. So eventually, when the e-commerce choose how much you are going to sell on this platform and how much of the logistics you're going to do yourself, well, this actually is a whole bundle of risk and return profile. So eventually, all of them are actually eventually composed a portfolio. So basically, by choosing how much you are going to sell and how much logistics you are doing to find yourself, you are actually doing a whole portfolio of, and eventually this becomes a portfolio selection problem. So I want to, I will not bore you by doing all the equations. Instead, let's talk about what are the intuitions we get from the results. So number one, we have to discuss two cases when there's no risk, and then we expect when there is risk. So when there's no risk, well, then whether you do it or not, well, it depends solely on two things. First is, well, do you have absolute advantage or relative advantage of doing it? What do we mean by that? Suppose, if you're Amazon, you already have, all the infrastructure there. You're already delivering, all the books and everything else. So you already have the delivery logistics there. So your cost will be actually lower than from the third-party sellers. So why not? So basically, for each unit, you're delivering, you have the lower cost than anyone else. So why don't you do it yourself? At the same time, if you look at the case in China, where we have people where it's rely absolutely everything on all the third parties. They don't have the logistics. Why? Because the initial investment is huge. At the same time, you have fragmented logistics sector in China where there are crazy competition over there. So it's already the cost for from third parties is already very low. So why would we do this? Right? And then of course, those are the color solutions here. We could have also cases where since some, at some volume, it makes sense for you to do it yourself, and the rest go to the third party. What's the criteria there? Well, the module costs have to be the same, right? That's when you have interior. But also, the other thing is, this is, the most critical here, but it's also size dependent. Because eventually, how much you are producing, the total size, of your operation also determines, well, what is going to be the cost, right? So basically, the two things together determines whether you are going to do it yourself or you are going to do it, by third party, or there's a hybrid model, right? But now when we have risk, when we immediately introduce risk, things become tricky, a lot trickier. So what do we know? First of all, if we have, those risk parameters, happen, in one of those sectors, then immediately this is the old model, right? Where when you have risk, you have less production. This is, what we call Back in grad school, let's go back to Sentinel, back in the 1970s. When you have risk, you produce less. Right? And when you produce less, well, you're going to your logistics. But the other thing is, this is, originally goes back to what, David many years ago with Richard Justin, that the correlation between them now. Why is that? Think about it. If you are building your own logistics, right? Why would you do it? One reason could be without risk, it's your lower cost. But the other reason could be, well, if you rely on third parties, they may not deliver on time, right? They could have and there could be fluctuation you cannot really control. So there's a risk factor there. But what does it also affect? It also affects your revenue because it hurts your reputation. So basically, the two are correlated. And then when they have that, what you might do, you might invest in your own logistics so that you reduce risk here, but you also reduce the risk by maintaining your reputation. So eventually, that's why we say this is a result where the reason you do vertical integration, the reason you want to do yourself, because partially and the rest is because it actually serves as interest. So that you are preventing that from happening. Right. And now we come to a few case studies. So this is the first case where Tom would tell me, look, I should go back to when we start we talk about our 2018 e-commerce statement, or remember one of the audience was asking, hey, well, well, it seems like there's no difference between Amazon and Walmart. And we're like, yeah, there's really no difference because Walmart would eventually behave more like Amazon, and that's exactly what we see right now, right? And so because this is you have more experience with, so Tom was saying, well, maybe let's give us the audience some more stories about what's going on all over the world. So in fact, we see everywhere it's the same thing. Where in Europe we see the case of Tesco, where this is a huge retailer, where traditionally they are competing with Amazon for those retail services, and it's been 2 decades over there, and originally they have started to think about doing the fresh e-commerce. And we still have after COVID, they accelerated started doing this, right? But then, guess what? You have a huge initial cost for doing this. Well, guess what? That's exactly what we see. You need to rely on third parties to start with your delivery services. That's what they did. So trying to get entry and scale up with partner with with the third party delivery firms like all this ones. I know it's a card on the other side. I'm not sure I know. And then they start to pivot or adapt to e-commerce. And guess what? So when we look at why they did this, they did their cost benefit analysis, strategically where when they think about the benefits, you need to run up very fast. Otherwise you lose the market share. Right? Otherwise, all people would just buy everything on Amazon. Then you don't have a market share. Well, but also you can make up your own capacity. Now, what about the costs? Well, like we said, brand is a very, very important, source of value for firms, especially for the C companies. Well, when you have, a few orders not being delivered on time, guess what? The consumers won't come here anymore. Brand, right? So that would be a big cost to their reputation. That is, their source for the revenue. And of course, you are going to have to, less pay for the delivery part of products. Right? And when they think about their own delivery, what are going to be the benefits and costs? Well, it's exactly the opposite story, right? You build a reputation, you build a brand. Well,
but you face the big threshold investment. And but what is the risk factor? The risk factor is that, look, what if this just, the COVID is just, a 3-month thing? Well, then after that, you build all that extra capacity and eventually find it useless. Right? This just become a standard asset, which probably don't have enough return to justify the investment. Right? So eventually what happens is after a few, probably a year and a half of their, collaborating with third parties, and eventually find, well, hey, this is the time. It justifies the investment. Well, simply because, we know the brand means a lot. So they want to make sure, hey, we need the Tesco truck here. So when people see the Tesco truck, they know, hey, they are going to ride on that. Thank you. They know they're going to ride it. Oh, it's the same thing in China. It's the same thing in China, where we have the case. Well, this is often the story where the people is, they rely, solely on third parties. But if you look at, how they become successful, it's another amazing story where, from my personal experience, I'm totally amazed because, I cannot really believe my parents would one day, use their phones to actually buy groceries online. They did, but they did. So they just use this app. And why is that? Well, they tell me, look, everything is so cheap there. So when we look at, how this is succeeded, their strategy is basically, look, there's Alibaba there. Well, there's Jingle there. Well, they're already taking a lot of the market share already. That's something we cannot compete. What we do, we want our target customers to be those people being affected by them. So when we look at the urban areas, there are some older people. And when it goes to and they also sell to the rural areas. So basically, everyone that is not your traditional e-commerce customers. But what is commonly known? They are price sensitive. My parents would only buy stuff when they're cheap. Well, me too. But so basically, they don't care about brands. They don't care about anything. They're price sensitive. So guess what? Eventually, that's what you see. Well, if having a brand means nothing to you, it doesn't really affect the revenue. It doesn't affect the risk. So what do you do? Well, you want to grow your market share, so you want a very, very high capacity, and immediately you are going to rely on third parties to do all the deliveries for you, especially because their cost is low. Right? So these are, in our mind, some of the most amazing stories here. And I guess I'm probably very good on time. Yeah. So with this, let me just stop here and see if we have questions.
I'm trying to get the person here, before the person comes, to switch to the next presentation. Any questions? Right, let's try. Thank you. Thank you, Liang.
Oh, sure.
I'm just curious. I think you your bullet point you didn't really touch on about the connections with farmers, right? So like the sourcing aspect, some of this on that end. What are can you speak to what some of the kind of innovations and interesting things that you're seeing on that side are in the context of e-commerce?
Sure. So that's a great
Thank
question. That's a great question. So in fact, in a full model, the portfolio does not only include logistics. So you also have the sourcing for the food, right? So if you look at what's happened to Amazon Fresh, 10 years ago when they first started, when they were trying, most of them are actually third parties. There's no such thing as the Amazon Fresh brand. You have Daniel's Farm,
you have Davis farms, right? So it's, it's basically everything, everyone is third party, right? But guess what? What Amazon find was, well, that would actually have problems for them because, again, you have to build a brand reputation. And you cannot do quality control company. And that is a big problem. So if you look at, after this, they bought Whole Foods, you can buy it from Amazon fraction right now, because there are only two things. It's either Whole Foods, which is already, a highly reputable brand, or the Amazon Fresh. Well, I don't know if they are trying to, make you get a feeling that, Amazon Fresh is as good as Whole Foods. Well, that's something I can stick to. But on the other hand, if you look at, the way that Pinduoduo works, where because they are targeting the buyers who don't care about it. So they would actually embrace Daniel's farm, David's farm, they would embrace anyone so that there's competition, so that they will make the cost even lower, right? And what they want to do is basically provide a minimum service, right? But to just increase competition so that they keep the price low and they keep reaching out more customers. And I guess so eventually what I'm trying to say is, the sourcing of the product is definitely, endogenous to the firm's strategic plans and who are they trying to target, right? And they're also, just one more minute. So there's also another side of the story. What if, Daniel Farm is already a very, very reputable farm, in this industry. That could also work. Where his target would probably not be Amazon. So we have this story, where, and I'm sure in Bay Area, there's this website where, it's a collection of all the high-end bakeries. And, I remember Tom told me that, look at all those, there are those high-end bakeries. So when you're buying from them, you're actually not because of the brand of the website, of the e-commerce platform. You're there because of the reputation of the seller, right? So I guess eventually all different kind of arrangements to emerge. It depends more on the platform, their choice of the portfolio.
Thank you.
Okay. Our next presenter, Daniel, will be talking about citrus supply chain.
All right, well, thank you very much, Zheng Fei. But students that said supply response can be estimated by master students and is trivial. We are I will be focusing today more on econometrics, more on. Okay, well. I hope to convince you that, especially for perennial crops, a subset of specialty crops, supply response estimation is difficult, and we're going to show you why, I hope, and what we're thinking about to improve that process. This is work in progress that I'm doing with my co-authors, Greg Astle, Zoe Plakius, and Jonathan Siegel. Greg's at USDA ERS, and Zoe and Jonathan are at the Ohio State University. And of course, the usual disclaimer applies. This is mostly my opinion. You're definitely getting the Daniel flavored version of this talk. If Zoe was presenting, I'm sure she'd emphasize different things. And this is definitely not the ERS's view on anything. So don't blame them. Okay, so this is part of a larger project that the ERS is running. They're interested in the US citrus industry and how the various impacts on that industry, mainly citrus greening, but other things like freezes and hurricanes and citrus canker and such, have affected the industry and what the future of the industry might be. In particular, they're interested in sort of like counterfactual scenarios of, well, what would happen if it got out of control here in California? What would that do to producer and consumer welfare and the kind of the location of supply? So our part of the project is to focus on the supply side of things, and in particular to try to look at the supply response for citrus and look at how this has been done historically. And so we have a working paper that is a sort of a literature review, which is a talk for another day, and then also kind of see how we can use this as a case study to hopefully improve the way that these supply elasticities are estimated. Now, the idea of this would be to put them into an EDM model and do kind of welfare counterfactuals. And kind of to David's point about ex ante and ex post estimation, if you want to do ex ante estimation of introducing a new crop or something like that, a new process, you need to have reliable estimates ex post so that when you put them into the model, you don't get garbage out. And in particular, well, I'll get to that point in a moment. So, you know, perennial specialty crops, which will be the focus today, there's of course many shocks that they may face, weather, pests, you know, changes in the trade situation, changes in the labor situation. We understand these, you know, we can make better policies, we can make better investment decisions. And so to my point previously, like are these supply elasticities that you can estimate stable in response to these shocks. So if you are saying, well, let's estimate what might happen with citrus greening in the future, we've used a supply elasticity that's been estimated in the past. Is that supply elasticity still actually going to be the same elasticity after the fact when you have some sort of structural shift, some shock? So we'll talk about how we're thinking about it. I have three objectives here. The first is to kind of just do a quick overview of some of the conceptual issues that are relevant to perennial crop supply response estimation, to show you how HLB intersects with many of these issues, and so why kind of thinking it from that more complicated perspective matters in at least this case, and then show how we think that state-space modeling is a promising econometric approach to sort of work through as many of these issues as possible, and we're kind of building on an existing literature there. So what makes perennials unique? Well, the main thing is that they are a productive asset. It's a long-term investment and it takes a long time to pivot. You can't just, you know, plant a whole lot of new 15-year-old orange trees. When COVID hits, you've got to wait 15 years to get those trees. And so the productivity of this asset will depend on the age of its asset, kind of with an age yield curve. And so this has a lot of implications. You know, any shocks that happen at any point in the life will have persistent effects over that crop's life. Any structural changes in the market may then change the value of those trees, which you should think of as assets, and then may change the planting and replacement decisions. The way those planting and replacement decisions will affect the overall productivity of, you know, a region, a farm, an industry. And also because this is a long-term kind of investment decision, price and cost expectations are usually much more important than the contemporaneous prices and costs that you observe in any one particular year. So all of this is making perennials more complicated than annuals. A piece that I'm going to focus on today is kind of the separability of kind of looking at yield and area for perennials. So when you're looking at annuals, broadly speaking, you can kind of separate yield and area. So if you have a shock, it might affect your yield, it might affect your area, and those two effects combined will give you the quantity shock. You know, I think Babcock's 2015 paper summarizes that kind of literature very well for corn and soy and the big commodity crops. But when we're looking at perennials, our shock is going to have several effects and they're going to interact with each other. So first, it may affect planting and removal decisions, which are going to affect both the total area and the age structure of that area, the mixture of trees of different ages. You'll also have a yield by age class. So different trees at different ages have got different yields, and that shock, for instance, like citrus greening, can affect, say, younger trees more than older trees. That change in age structure and that any change in the yield by age class will combine to give you a sort of average yield, and then you combine that with the total area, and then you get your total quantity response. And as far as we can tell, the existing literature on perennial crop supply estimation hasn't sort of dealt with all of these channels simultaneously. You know, French King and Minami, important paper back in 1985, dealt with most of this, but they looked at the yield by age class as kind of separate linear trends. So it wasn't jointly estimated with what was happening over on the area side of things. Knapp and Conyard did this with state space estimation. And similarly, they did a linear trend for yield and estimated just the relative yields of alfalfa in California in that case, and kept that relative yield constant over the time horizon. Calazandanakis and Schonkweiler also using a state-based approach, only really focused on area and planting and removals, and didn't go all the way down to the quantity response, which is what matters for a simulation. Okay, and so the recent, as far as we can see, the more recent papers in this area have then used the approaches by one of those three papers or even earlier approaches. We haven't seen sort of conceptual updates since the early 90s. And if anyone's aware of some, I would be very grateful to know. So illustrating why this matters, first consider, an orchard, a growing region in year zero composed of like old trees that have high yields. And if we change the age structure over time, you can see that the average yield of these orchards will go down. So we're kind of increasing the share of young trees, which are lower yields, and that would decrease the average total yield of this kind of growing region. But similarly, that's an age structure effect, but we can have a yield effect, age by yield effect, which gives you, observationally exactly the same effect on total yields. But in this case, we've got trees of essentially the same age, but we're kind of thinking of the yield per tree going down from 6 units per tree down to 2 units, 3 units per tree. And so if you just observed total yield, you wouldn't know if that is because of changes in age structure or changes in yield per tree without diving more deeply into the data. So why is this relevant? Well, for HLB at least, Huanglong being citrus greening disease, if you're familiar with citrus, it has kind of been the big story of the last decade. It's going to have, I think, all of these effects. So it reduces yields for given trees, it kills trees, it has differential yield impacts depending on the age of the tree. So this is some work that was done by a team from Florida, and this is just kind of pre-HLB, post-HLB yield by trees, and you can see that post-HLB, the yields for young trees didn't change very much, but for old trees it changed quite a bit. But very old trees, not so much change. The point is it has differential effects by age. Another study, this was out of Brazil, looking at the lifetime effect of HLB depending on when the infection happened. So if the infection happened to an old tree, it doesn't have a very large yield effect. If the infection happens to, say, a 4-year-old tree, that has a very large effect on its lifetime yields. So how can we try and bring all these things together into a single kind of econometric model to get a supply response that is cognizant of all of these impacts? So we're thinking that a state space, those two papers, it is able to explicitly account for age structure and aging dynamics. It will allow for separate planting and removal equations. It will allow for different yield and area impacts by age. And another great thing about state space models in general is that they have kind of separate observation and state equations. So they can easily account for missing data or data that is kind of functions of state variables. You don't necessarily have to observe every single age to be able to still model the dynamics of those ages. So broadly speaking, if you're not familiar with state space models, this is kind of a generic linear state space model where you have two sets of equations, a state equation and an observation equation, and each of these can be a whole lot of vectors. So your state equation can be arbitrarily many states and arbitrarily many observations. So you have a transition matrix that kind of governs the inherent transition between the state in t-1 to state t, and that can be modified by, before I say that, we also have an observation construction matrix which links observations to states. So in the simplest form, you would just observe each state directly, but maybe you observe total production, which would be, well, let's just say you observe total area, which would be the sum of all of those individual areas. So you might have as states areas by age, and you observe total area. You can also include in this kind of exogenous drift terms, exogenous covariates, and this is where our shocks like HLB, price responses and other things would come into the modeling process. And then you have various errors. You can have errors or shocks, idiosyncratic shocks to the state process. They can be kind of arbitrarily correlated and have state variable level variances, and then you can also have errors in observation as well. So taking this approach and starting from a simple point, this is not taking age structure into account, but this is just to highlight the fact that at least both area and yield is likely to matter, and then we will dive into the age structure. So we take that generic framework and apply it to area and yield simultaneously. So our state equations are log area and log yield. We'll have some sort of arbitrary transition matrix, so an arbitrary autocorrelation and then a covariance between those two states. And then we've got two exogenous covariates here. One is the expected price lagged by 4 years. So this is kind of taking a bearing acres approach. And so a change in the expected price 4 years ago will affect bearing acres this year because of that sort of non-bearing lag. And then we also have a measure of HLB prevalence, in this case at Florida at the state level. And then errors, our observation equations will be we observe area, we observe yield, and then we're also adding in production as an extra variable here, which is the sum of log area and yield, which allows us to kind of make a forecast, which you'll see in a moment. So when you run this model, you get an interesting effect. So we can, this is also, these data have been z-scored for ease of estimation. So the y-axis isn't particularly informative, but the shapes are. On the left-hand side, you see bearing acres. The blue line is the estimated acres over the last 40 years. The blue line for yield is estimated yield. You can see it has this great big drop in 2010 or so. And then production is kind of the product of those two, the sum. In this case, it's logged. The red line is sort of the counterfactual. If we set HLB to 0, rather, you estimate this with the observed HLB, then you set HLB to 0, you can kind of see what the impact of HLB is on both area and yield and total production. And you can see that, at least in this particular framework, which is very similar to one that was used by Spreen in 2014 for their model, the area effect is relatively small. The yield effect is very large, and in this case, statistically significant. And then production went, counterfactual production is significantly higher without HLB, and that's clearly driven by yield rather than acres. So I would say, contra Spreen, the yield effects are far more important in this story than the area effects. So how do we start to bring in those yield effects? Well, Florida is this amazing state because they actually have measured the acreage by age over the last 60, 70 years. So you can observe that directly. You don't have the problem of trying to infer that, which is something we want to do so we can port this modeling approach over to other crops. But at the moment, we're dealing with like almost the best of all possible worlds for data sources. Florida records it by year for the first 24 years, and then it bins it into these age, stage classes, a 25 to 34-year-old bin, 35 to 44, and 45 plus. And so we can use that to construct a transition matrix to say basically that, a 3-year-old tree next year has to have come from a 2-year-old tree in the previous year. So we've just allowed plantings to be autocorrelated in some arbitrary way. And then 2-year-old trees have to be a function of 1-year-old trees. 3-year-old trees come from 2-year-old trees all the way down over here. And then we have stage structures. So we kind of have the 24-year-old trees feed into 25-year-old category. They stay in that category for a while, and then some of them move up into the next category. And then hidden over here are those covariates. And so any differences from age to age are being driven by those exogenous covariates or those idiosyncratic shocks. So we can fit this model to the existing data, and it fits it very well. So this is the observed and estimated area by age for Florida over the last 40 years. And yes, like this modeling approach can very accurately reproduce the observed data. And this is kind of where my story is going to finish, because this is, as I said, a work in progress. The next step is to simultaneously put yield into this and allow yield and area to feed back into each other. And then also have those HLB impacts coming in and affecting yield potentially differentially. Now, a big question, we have a bunch of big questions. First is, is it going to be econometrically possible to estimate all of these effects that we're interested in when keeping track of all of these different lines of data, or are we going to have to sort of aggregate them up into sort of various stages, like 1 to 10 years, 10 to 20 years? And also, how many effects can we actually simultaneously measure with this available data? Also, kind of questions about causality here. The length of run of these estimates. Well, the nice thing about a state-space model is you can calculate impulse response functions and essentially get elasticities of any arbitrary length that you're interested in. You can find the short run effects, 5-year effects, 10-year effects, and whatever your ex-ante model needs, you can calculate the relevant run of elasticity to put into that. Now, there's a few problems with this already. One is that there may be nonlinearity in the observation equations. In particular, if you're looking at production and you're trying to break that into the kind of the sum product of yield by age, then you can't just log linearize it like I did with the aggregate approach. And so we may have to switch to a non-linear state-space modeling framework. Fortunately, there's been a lot of work done in that area over the last 10 years, and there are some packages that have come out for R and other things that could allow us to do that. Also, the process errors are generally assumed to be Gaussian, but theoretically they should be non-Gaussian, because you can't have more old trees next year than you had young trees this year. And the model as written actually allows trees to magically come out of the woodwork. I don't know how big a problem that is. And then the last thing we want to do is much more of a conceptual thing, is to bring in some of these other issues that Jimmy and David have been talking about. So we had like bringing in middlemen, bringing in market power, and seeing if those can be incorporated into this approach simultaneously. That would be lovely. We're not sure if that's going to work at all or not. So to finish up, thank you. The take-home messages I'd like to give you are that perennial supply responses can be confounded by the interactions by yield and age structure. Something like HLB is going to have impacts through all of these different channels simultaneously. So if you want to model its impacts, you need to have a modeling framework that can deal with all of those channels. It seems like state-space modeling is a really promising framework to incorporate all those impacts, but we are still very much a work in progress, and we'll be very grateful for your comments, feedback. If you know before notes that might be useful here, we'll also be very glad to know. Thank you. David.
Yeah, this is come from experience of working in the world. I think that what happened is, generally speaking, the key question is when you start having, I'll give you an example. In Cocoa in Africa, the acreage rarely changes. Why does it change? Because most people that grow cocoa are old people. Until the next generation will come, they will continue to have what they have. So to me, I think one of the most interesting things is to estimate acreage on case-by-case basis. There is an element of endogeneity
At the farm level, you mean?
at the farm level. And to me, what really would make totally different is to try to develop a logic to see what type of farmers will cut the losses and what type of farmer would basically let it go. And I think that is that is a driver. So I wouldn't be surprised if it would change, but how bad it has to be in order for people to change their crops. Would they move to another crop? These are the real issues. And again, when I walk to speak, this is the question that they ask. Suppose you have a disease in Africa. What do you do? Some people continue to grow the tree, other people after a while decided to grow corn.
Thank you. And I think I saw another question at the back. Good point. Thank you. The gentleman right at the back, and then this one.
Good, so just going to the econometrics, you're currently using maximum likelihood estimation.
Expectation maximizer, yeah.
Oh, okay. You might consider Bayesian filtering.
Mhm,
As a
yeah.
way of, you know,
That's all the nonlinear approaches are using Bayesian at the moment.
the particle filtering and things like that.
Exactly. Thank you.
So I just wanted to bring up, this kind of reminds me of the cattle cycle literature.
Mm.
Because it's another commodity where age stock matters, like. I know that was like Rosen's initial thing, he was trying to explain, I think, like negative price supply response, right? And it doesn't seem like that's the case, but I don't know if there's like a conceptual link to some of the cattle, like the cattle cycle literature. The other thing I wanted to bring up is that your state-based transitions for trees and age, trees are not allowed to die in this model. And
Oh no, so they are being, they can be removed. But that would be happening in the kind of exogenous drift terms or in the exogenous covariates rather than sort of intrinsically. So that was just trying to capture the aging constraints, and then any death is coming from the other
intentional removal.
Yes.
Okay, is there any like unexpected mortality and maybe more true?
Oh, there definitely is, yes. But the point is that would be captured in like a drift term or the HLD term or something like that. Or in the random shocks, if it's just random death from year to
Not
year.
in the transition.
Yeah, they're trying to capture the kind of the theoretical change from year to year rather than, and then the empirical component comes in the other terms. Great question.
Real basic thing, where's the damage data coming from? Are the producers recording losses? I'm wondering how it matches up with your age structure data that you have.
Yeah, so the HLB data in this case comes from a paper. It's just reporting prevalence of HLB at the state level.
Okay.
But there are surveys that we use to generate that data that can be disaggregated at least the county level that we might dive into as we go along. But I think
we can maybe continue.
Thank you.
This stuff now.
Mochi, 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 mochi. Come here right now. Come here.
Anyway, this is the last presentation. Wait, going local, how far can we go? So in last decades or
It's
two,
not you.
there's been increasing talk about going local, buying local, a lot of research on this. Today, we're going to talk about that. First, I'm going to ask my co-author, Iris, who is in the audience, to give a short talk about empirical observation, and then I will move on to the theoretical model, why local, and present the conceptual framework, and then we can discuss the expected results and conclude the presentation. This is the ongoing research. Iris.
Hello, everyone. I'm Iris. I'm Dr. Gwen's first year student. So just give you a background story, how from here and lead to the mathematical modeling of Dr. Gwen's work. So the local movement hubs in the southeast has been researched, and it's driven by the growth of craft breweries. So hops are used in the process of making beer to add bitterness and aroma, especially one of the key ingredients in craft beer. IPA use the highest hopping rate and followed by other types of beer. So in the United States, the Northwest, the Pacific Northwest makes the majority of production of hops, led by Washington with 74%, and then Idaho and Oregon made up the rest of the hops production. So in the southeast, explored because the explosion of craft brewery industry, and there are a need for local hops. But there are a lot of key challenges in the production of hops. And production challenges are the most key issues in terms of growing hops. In the Pacific Northwest, the day length is perfect for hops production, whereas here in the well, not here, but in Florida, in the southeast, like the day length is a lot shorter, so it's not enough for growing hops. So that's one of the key issues. And seasonality in the Northwest, there's a chilling period required for hops to store energy during the winter season. But in Florida, you can imagine that requirement is hard to be met. And there are some variety challenges because this is new emerging commodities in the Southeast. So it requires a couple of years for that kind of innovation. So those are the key challenges. And then there are other challenges like the financial viability, quality, consistency. And those are the things that brewery really cares about, is the product quality and consistency, because they want to produce the same taste of kind of beer year after year, season after season. But without the consistency and the quality, it's really difficult for the breweries to purchase local hops as well. And there are infrastructure challenges such as storage and processing. A lot of hops the breweries prefer are palletized, and with small growers in Southeast and in Florida, they don't have the palletizing processing facility, and that costs a lot of capital as well. So kind of widening the entrance of hop production. So which kind of look at the establishment cost and annual production cost compared to the Pacific Northwest. It's about $8,000 per acre to establish hops in the Pacific Northwest, whereas elsewhere it varies dramatically. And in the Florida, researchers found that it costs about $15,000 to $18,000 per acre just to establish an acre of commercial hops. So you can tell the huge difference and in the establishment cost. And the annual cost for Northwest is about $13,000 per acre annually for production. In Florida or in the Southeast, we probably need higher labor requirements because of the extended season in Florida, extended harvest season, and growers may expect a higher fertilization rate and higher water need because of the poor soil, sandy soil quality in Florida. And there are other production challenges such as high pest and disease pressures because the environment and humidity, the temperature. So we estimated a total added annual cost at $6,000 per acre. So combine all that, we kind of estimate the break-even price or a local price premium the growers have to need for their production to be making a profit. And the average national average price of dry hops is price we can see the Southeast or Florida growers, and at a like 1,600 pounds, which can be reached by Florida researchers. And we need at least 100% price premium for them to break even. So that kind of lead to the story of then why do we do local? So then Dr. Guan will introduce the rest.
Thank you, Iris. I'm going to take over for the rest. So as we're seeing here, there's a huge difference in cost and profitability. And in Florida, it's the growing conditions that don't even allow to grow the local hops because the day length is too short. We have to light up the bulbs for additional light. So that's raises the question. When we talk about economics, we know the fundamental principles of specialization and trade with each other, and there's competitive advantages. If we respect that, we increase the efficiency. That's how the society is organized and the economies are organized. So I was thinking, hey, going local, how far can we go? Because obviously we're violating economic principles. Is this good or bad? In some cases we have seen a lot of business just failed because they talk about going local. They've gone too far. In other cases, supply chains are stretched too far, in fact. So where is the boundary? That is the research question. How can we conceptualize the research problem and model it? Okay, so like, what is the pros of going local? Of course, when we talk about going local, the first thing is less carbon footprint. Okay, that's the selling point. And then the second point is, local business is feeding back to the local economy. For example, I'm hiring workers, I'm creating jobs, and the labor income will stay in the community. So they increase other business opportunities. That's a multiplier effect to the economy. So that is the main argument. And then what's disadvantage? Of course, economic efficiency. Local production might not be efficient, and environmentally, is of course maybe there's less carbon footprint from transportation, but there might be other issues like local production. When you use more energy, more fertilizer, that might generate more carbon footprint, in fact. So what looking at that, when you're talking about your own economic multiplier effect, you're assuming other regions don't have that. Actually, the other regions might also have economic multiplier effect. It depends on how much is that. What is the big? What is the difference? So this is a conceptual framework. So first we go from firm profit optimization, and then after the firm solves their maximization problem, for example, the local firm maximizes the profit, and then determine the production level, and then the larger farm, more national or more efficient firm will produce for the bigger market and also supply the remaining part of the local market. Then after they both optimize their production decisions, then we can calculate the profit and the economic multiplier effect, and also externalities, the carbon footprint. We can price that into the society welfare and see what is that. And then the second approach would be like society level optimization, balancing the local and non-local production, right? Then after that, that also balance economic multiplier effect, externality, everything in a society welfare function. And at that maximized level of society welfare, then we see what is the local production, what is the non-local production. Then we can go back and see what is the local profit, what is the non-local profit. So that is the another way, system level optimization. But obviously, these two approaches, two perspectives will generate different results. So how do we model that? First, we will assume the non-local farm will do the maximization problem, solve the profit maximization problem, and then after that we will calculate the economic multiplier effect and externalities, how much was generated. Then we can get an idea of the society welfare, which is a function of the profit, the multiplier effect, externality from production, as well as from transportation. And this is the model we can use as basically profit maximization subject to the production function with simple assumption without risk. And after we solve the problem, we can calculate the multiplier effect. This is the multiplier effect. At the firm level, only look at profit, but at society level, this is the revenue. P multiplies the yield is a revenue. Revenue includes profit, firm profit, as well as the cost, labor cost, etc. But this cost part actually does stay in the community, circulating. So that also counts for the local community. So we look at the revenue and this is the multiplier effect. Then we also account for the externalities. So then that is social welfare or society welfare. Then After that, a local firm enters the local market, then producers pay price premium. But local firm based on that information, like price information, local production function that maximizes its own profit. Then after that, the non-local firm will take over the rest of the market. Then we add up the two firms' activity together. We will get an idea what is the profit, what is society benefit. So this is a local maximization problem. Then there's non-local maximization problem. There's a constraint because the non-local maximization, because a part of the local market is already taken by the local producers. So the non-local firm can only supply the rest of the market. Okay. And then we can calculate the society function again. Then the last step is to look at the system level optimal issue. Like we solve system level welfare optimization problems, simultaneously accounting for the externalities and economic multiply effects. So we can solve for society level optimal production for the local firm, society level optimal production for the non-local firm, and we can see what are their profits. Definitely, they're going to be different from firm optimization. That's a different objective function. So this is the model, and then we account for different constraints: production, local production, the non-local production constraints, and externalities. So we just assume the simple externality function is a function of inputs and transportation. After solving this, we compare the results from different optimization problems, like the stage 2 is local plus non-local firm, but they are based on the firm profit maximization, and then the third stage is the system level optimization. And we solve the optimal productions. We compare the optimal production under different scenarios and firm level profits, and definitely they are going to be different, and society level benefit is going to be different. Externalities, we can compare that, and then we see there is a boundary. So that boundary for local production is this optimal level solved by maximizing the society welfare function. So beyond this level, we're saying it's going too far. And below this level, it's like maybe too globalized. The supply chain is stretched too long. That's not optimal as well. So this optimal level of local supply, or the boundary, or the threshold, is a function of multiple factors. So we can look at what are the factors affecting this boundary, this threshold. What are local production function? We look at this parameter alpha is different. Normally, we can assume like non-local production is more efficient. For example, alpha is 0.9, and local production, the coefficients like alpha is 0.6. So there's a difference, productivity difference. We can define the difference and see what is the impact of the productivity difference on the boundary, on the threshold. And then we can also look at the multiply effect difference. Then we can see, okay, what is the impact of the productivity difference on the local production, local market share, the boundaries, threshold. We think that's the result is negative, obviously, and also the multiply effect. If we go back, this one we assume the local multiply effect is higher than the non-local multiply effect. For local, like normally might be a poorer community, when you have you're pumping on like a income into the community, it will probably have a higher multiply effect. So we can also look at that impact of, obviously, when you have a bigger difference, the higher the local multiply effect, you will see that the local production should be higher. The threshold should be higher. Okay, we can also look at the impact of this productivity difference, multiplier effect difference on the society level benefit and on externalities. Okay, and there are other factors. For example, there are price premium, local price premium. How does this affect the optimal allocation of local and non-local production? And distance, how far is the non-local production shipped to the local community? If it's too long, the supply chain is stretched too long and it's generating too much externalities. So this conceptual framework can be extended in different directions, like by including like policy tool, how can the government affect the decision, make a decision like a tax, whatever other policy, they can influence the local production, the profit maximization problem. And we can also introduce a risk and, to see what's the impact of the risk. Maybe that risk component is especially relevant when we look at the supply chain resilience issue and other risk issues. And we can add another product then, to make the model framework more general. Yeah, that's basically the framework of this research. It's ongoing. We're still working on it. Any questions? All right. Okay, thank you.
I really like, I tell you, I really like it. It's too theoretical, not in the plan, it's theoretical. But what are the reasons that in many communities you have local production? There is a multiplier effect. But you can actually look at unemployment, the issue of unemployment. Unemployment is costing to society.
Yeah.
So if a society say now generally who is unemployed? Most is unemployed, generally males, that cannot do a lot. So you can either drive or work in the field. So you may have a situation to generate local jobs, and so you may increase the cost of consumers, but you reduce the cost of society because you save unemployment insurance. So the way I look at it is, this can be a great paper. You can call it local production and implicit tax. An implicit tax to subsidize employment. So my feeling is it can be efficient if you have, so for example, comparative study. Higher unemployment payment basically result in a higher likelihood to local production if it allow you to move to increase local employment. Right. So my feeling, instead of only looking at all this people are input output, the community is great. So if you have two communities, but like if you have a green community, blue or red community, if you have a blue, if you have a red community that have negative, positive value and externalities, that one thing you have blue community. So you can do all of this stuff. Yeah. But I think it's a really interesting mechanism because it can reduce the tax burden.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a good comment. About the local benefit, like employment, David mentioned. Actually, this model framework can also reflect part of that story by looking at the multiplier effect. Because when you generate jobs, you pay workers, and the worker receive the labor cost, the labor income. That income is the cost, part of the cost. So that's why when we look at the multiplier effect,
look at it also the impact on government expenditure. Because government, the biggest problem in every place is public finance. People don't have to pay taxes. If you have unemployment, then you don't pay. If you don't have unemployment payment, then you have right. You have unemployment payment, rich people don't have to pay taxes. This is the way that they will pay taxes in a way that they don't mind.
Yeah, that's good comment as well about tax. In the future, we can incorporate taxes, not only that kind of tax, we also want to see whether a carbon tax, other type of tax that is designed to influence the firm activities could actually increase total society benefit. Because I'm imagining that the tax rate could be the optimal social level tax rate could be zero in this case, like to influence the carbon or other effect. elements of the model, but it could also be positive. There can be a positive tax rate. When you increase the tax rate, you will change the behavior of the players in the system. Then it will increase the society level benefit. But then we should be able to solve for optimal tax rate.
But also if you do it itself, let's look at different society. In Europe, they don't have clear issue of unemployment. They don't care about carbon, so they have one thing.
Right.
And then, so my feeling is you can have several case studies, and you can go to a general journal. The nice thing to go to the real mainstream economic journal if you tell all the story of the general story.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. Any other questions?
So the very nice model. So I have two things on my mind. One is, I'm wondering if the result could have a trade interpretation. Where
Actually-
essentially is the, oh, please, sorry.
Yeah, of course. This design actually, when we talk about this, the larger farm, national farm, is of course you can interpret as another player, like or international player. Okay, certainly extract that or that additional component as like we can say, hey, there's some like another country. Then it's applied to this national market, also the local community. But then in that case, we'll have to adjust the model framework a little bit because the optimization framework is we have like, especially when I want to talk about the carbon tax. It's only within the country. But if you
I'm sorry, I misspoke. So I'm not saying you need a different model. I'm just saying the results you currently have doesn't have a trade interpretation where so basically why do we want this amount local? So you introduce inefficiency, but because your comparative advantage
right.
is in the multiplier and also in the reducing externality, so both eventually makes the society level cost being lower. So that's your comparative advantage eventually. So I'm not sure if that
Actually, it does have the same interpretation. When we talk about like externality and carbon footprint, carbon does not only affect one country, it's a global impact. So when we optimize the system level benefit, of course, you can interpret that as multipliers from different countries, specifically as a industrial trade interpretation, whether we should import all the products all the way from the other side of the world, like from Asia, then in that case, now we have talked a lot about supply chain disruptions. Then if we want to look at that part, we should introduce a risk element into this system. Then, of course, we will certainly have a trade interpretation and supply chain. Interpretation as well.
Yeah, and also local, they're buying local because they feel about it. So in that sense, is there an element, what is the role of the consumer? So we need a role of consumer. Where, so is that, so
That's a good point.
I'm trying to think, is that where your price premium coming from? So, they're paying the higher prices because they feel good about it.
Right.
And, but that's the case, isn't that also part of the social welfare?
Actually,
I don't know.
on this one, we only look at the objective part. The subjective satisfaction is not as part of this model, but maybe we can think of a way to extend the model and include that subjective part, but it's hard. But all the elements we talked about in this model framework, the conceptual framework can be measured. But the only tough part is that externality. How do you define? How do you get the parameters about externality, the cost? So about carbon, we perhaps use the carbon market price, but still we can simulate a range. We don't have to use the real number. We can simulate a range and map the impact. For every estimate parameter, we can calculate social benefit of the local production level. Then we map it. Then that's the way to show the impact. Implications of the model, right? Thank you.
We're 10 minutes over, so we should probably close.
Yeah, that's time. Sorry for this long discussion and yeah, thanks everybody. Yeah. Okay, yeah.
就是说